The first frost silvered the pines around the field headquarters at Rassenburg. From the tall, narrow window in the timber hut assigned to the Air Ministry liaison, Colonel Dieter Hecht could see the runway ghosting farther than it existed, a mirage of concrete on which no Luftwaffe bomber would ever land. It was mid-October 1940, and the war's calendar had flipped without permission. The invasion barges in the Channel ports were gathering rain, not infantry. A courier arrived with the morning's Luftwaffe Lodgebericht situation report, folded twice and still damp from the duplicator. Hecht didn't sit. He read standing, as if the news required posture to contain it. Sortie rates declining. Serviceability low. Fighter losses heavy. Bomber crews fatigued. British sector stations repaired within hours. Radar masts reappearing like weeds. Night raids not decisive. Morale. The sentence trailed into euphemism. Hecht exhaled. The RAF, that stubborn island spine, was still flying, torn, exhausted, sometimes down to its last squadrons, but flying. The battle the Führer had promised would be the final air reckoning, had stalemated and then slipped. And if the air was not conquered, the sea would remain a moat, and Sea Lion would remain an animal in a notebook. Boots clicked behind him. Field Marshal Keitel, the Prussian statue come to life, entered without waiting to be announced. Hecht, the Führer wishes the latest figures in person. The latest, Hecht said, have a habit of being the same as the previous. Keitel's face didn't move. Bring them. They crossed the corridor at a pace that allowed no thought. Around them, staff officers glided with folders like surgeons with instruments. The smell was paper and phenol, an antiseptic for the mind. 2. A map of air that wouldn't behave. Hitler's briefing room was a cave with electric suns. Lamps poured down on a map of southern England and the Channel, squares pinned with colored flags. Red for bombers, yellow for fighters, blue for targets hit, black for targets that refused to classify themselves as dead. A wet shine coated the map's surface where coffee had been wiped and the world had bent. Göring stood near the map in his Luftwaffe blues, expanded by metals. A thurible of cigar, smoke always seemed to hang near him, a private storm cloud. Beside him, Jeschneck, young, brilliant, already old in the eyes, scanned tables with a gaze that punished error. Hitler arrived softly, as if the door had not needed to open for him. He took his place at the head of the table and flattened his palm on the wood, a gesture Hecht had learned to read. Impatience becoming plan. Report, Hitler said. Hecht passed the Lodgebericht across. Göring intercepted it with a magician's flourish, as if to transform bad news into theater. He read 2 lines, frowned at the paper as though it had betrayed him, and handed it on. Why? Hitler asked calmly. Are these English not finished? Silence cracked, and Jeschneck filled it. My Führer, the enemy's air defense system is not merely brave pilots. It is an apparatus. Our intelligence confirms that their coastal radar warns of our approach. Their fighters are not sent at random, but vectored by radio from ground controllers. Damaged airfields resume operations with alarming swiftness. Factories disperse. And, he swallowed, their pilots rotate in a manner that preserves experience. Göring laughed a bark. Yes, they have poles and radios. We have fighters and will. We have the eagle. We have the eagle with clipped talons, Hecht said before he could stop himself. Our bombers require escort. We cannot always provide at range. Our twin-engine fighters are not what we hoped. The Bf 109 cannot linger over Kent. Fuel dictates tactics. Göring turned, a planet rotating. Colonel Hecht, when you last flew an operational sortie. Oh, that's right, you did not. Laughter flitted and died. Hitler raised a finger. The room froze. I asked, Hitler said, each word placed like a stone, why they are not finished. Not why they are admirable. Not why they continue to behave like Englishmen. Why we have not negated them. Jeschneck chose his sacrificial sentence. Because, my Führer, we attacked their courage and found a network. The word hung. Network. Hecht could almost see the chain. The radar masts, to the plotting rooms, to the sector stations, to the squadrons, to the dispersals, to the maintenance bays, to the factories and back again. A loop that turned damage into a timetable. Hitler's eyes, Pale coins shifted to the map. He touched the area around London with one fingertip, and then the string of sector aerodromes like a piano teacher picking out notes. We struck their fields. The fields lived. He touched London again. Then we struck their city. The city endures. Morale can be measured by flame, Göring said. We have lit many. Flame is not a gauge, Hitler replied. It was softly said, and Hecht saw Göring flinch. 3. The words he chose for defeat. Later historians would argue forever about what Hitler really said when the RAF won the battle he had wagered would decide an invasion. He never admitted defeat. He rarely did. But he had a way of addressing the air when reality insisted. He spoke to the ceiling, not to men, as if dictating to fate. That morning he said, "Very well. If the sky will not break, we shall make it irrelevant." He turned from the map and faced his generals, Keitel and Jodl from the army, Redder from the navy, Göring armored in feathers. England fights as the head of an octopus. Sever the head? Perhaps impossible at present. Then we cut the tentacles. We starve them. We burn their lifelines. We turn the Mediterranean into a German lake, the Atlantic into a hunting ground. We force the island to live on its own breath, and then we take away the lungs. U-boats, Redder murmured, relieved to have his noun. U-boats, Hitler confirmed, and night bombers. We will deprive them of sleep, if not of sky. As for the Channel invasion, he let the sentence evaporate. No man in the room chased it. He looked again at the map with something like curiosity. The English fought not with aces, but with a system. Interesting. Very interesting. He smiled without amusement. They had better keep it intact. They will need it when we return with tools that obey different mathematics. Different mathematics, my Führer? Hecht asked, forgetting to be a piece of furniture. Rockets, Hitler said almost tenderly. Engines whose courage does not waver. Weapons that ignore pilots and their unions with fear. I do not abandon an idea. I postpone it until the world is ready to be convinced. He closed the folder as if closing a season. We will say publicly that the operation against the English Air Force achieved its aims, that the enemy is weakened, that we have taught them their vulnerability. The people must not eat doubt. They require bread of victory, even when we bake with flour of patience. Göring, ever the impresario, clapped once as if to punctuate. Then we have not been defeated, he announced. We have merely recomposed. Hecht watched Hitler nod, to Göring, to the gods, to the idea of himself. He wondered whether truth ever raised its hand in such rooms. For the fighter boys across the water. News traveled strangely in wartime, by rumor, by air, by the invisible threads between men who had smelled the same smoke. On the far side of the channel, in a dispersal hut at Biggin Hill, a pilot with oil under his nails and sleep in his eyes told a new arrival. They're easing daylight a bit. Night raids now. Their lot don't linger like they did. We must have nicked their petrol tanks. Laughter, another voice, or their nerve. A third, older, not their nerve. Their arithmetic. The controllers in the sector station smoked more than was good for them and pushed croupiers' rakes across felt plots until they dreamed in vectors. They had won by not dying, by repairing faster than the enemy could destroy, by being moved on a giant chessboard where radar played the part of clairvoyant. They would be heroes later. For now, they were men who woke when the telephone rang and ran when someone shouted "scramble" and cried when the names on the blackboard were wiped rather than rotated. Hecht had a British photograph in his pocket, procured by intelligence, God knew how. It showed a line of hurricanes on a muddy field, ground crew in overalls, a pilot midway into his machine, a dog watching with worse hope than any man. On the back, in pencil, someone had written, "We shall continue." He had wanted his life's work to result in a saluted runway, not a sentence. But here, in this winter's start, the sentence seemed more powerful than runways. 5. Göring's private theater. The Reichsmarschall made a show of regathering prestige. He announced new directives with butcher's verbs, to carve, to smash, to bleed. He toured fighter units and demanded they fly higher, lower, differently. He offered medals the way doctors offer sweets. He inspected photographs of bomb damage and drew circles with a silver pen, forgetting that circles are not fires. He ordered the development of the Me-210, the He-177, anything with numbers that promised to mean more than the arithmetic of defeat. In a small, smoky room after a long, humid meeting, Goring cornered Hecht as if accidentally. "You were impertinent in there," he said with the dignity of a man not used to hearing it. "But I like men who bleed arithmetic when they are cut." Hecht bowed. "Arithmetic sometimes demands blood." Goring regarded him with the solemnity he reserved for expensive paintings. "Do you think them invincible, these islanders?" "No," Hecht said. "Only organized." Goring snorted. "Organization is a mood. It fails under pressure." Hecht wanted to reply. "Ours did," he said. "Then we must become the pressure." 6. The speech he didn't give. Propaganda drafts of a speech circulated the next week, an address Hitler might deliver to explain the shift. It was never given. Instead, radio announcers in perfect German intoned a milder narrative. But Hecht saw one draft, unofficial, probably written by Goebbels himself with the relish of a playwright, and he imagined Hitler actually speaking it to the nation. "We have tested the English in the element that suits them and found them skilled. Very well. We will choose a different element. The sea was always their accomplice. We will court the night, court the distance, court the coming age of the engine whose pilot is mathematics. The battle for England will not be decided by boys with wings painted on their hearts, but by men who build things that do not argue. Until then, France is ours, the Balkans will be ours, Russia will be taught, and England will discover what it means to breathe through a straw." The paper ended there, as if to leave room for applause. Hecht folded it carefully and placed it back where he'd found it. He felt the weary admiration a craftsman feels for a rival's beautiful lie. 7. The letter Hecht never sent. Hecht's wife had been relocated from Berlin after the last sizable raid. She was staying with cousins in Bavaria. He wrote her a letter he would not post. "Elise, someone asked the Führer today why the English are not finished. The answer, I think, is that they learned to turn courage into a procedure, and we tried to turn courage into a flag. Our men fly bravely. There's land and time to fly again. Our factories boast. There's produce. I am not disloyal. I simply find the truth useful." He said, this is what he said, that if the sky would not break, we would make it irrelevant. "We will hunt their ships at night and pretend that hunger is invisible. We will build rockets. Perhaps the future will look like him. I hope it is not. If the war ever comes to us in a way that no map can deny, remember this. Some battles are won because a small country refused to misplace its screws and schedules. I do not know if history will believe me. History prefers heroes to clerks. Yours, D." He did not send it. He burned it over an ashtray and watched the smoke. German, British, human. 8. What he said to himself. Hitler slept little, ate less, paced most. Witnesses would later remember him standing over the map of England as if contemplating a chess problem whose solution existed only in a variant of the rules. In such moments he did speak aloud, but not to men. "You have your system," he said to the island and its astringent defenders. "I have time." It was the sort of sentence that wins for a night and loses for a decade. 9. The turn to the east. Orders proliferated. Diversions to the Balkans. Preparations that could only mean one thing to men who read logistics the way others read palms. The great Eastern appetite had awakened in him again. If England would not fall by air, it would be isolated by geography. If not isolated by geography, by the collapse of her last friend on the continent. Hecht understood the arithmetic again. If the West refused a decision, the East would provide one. But he also knew that arithmetic can be treacherous when it tries to calculate winter. Before he left for Berlin to take up a new desk that would be farther from the window and closer to the furnace, he visited the runway one last time. It was still a mirage. The frost had melted. A line of crows watched him from a pine, black notes on a staff. What did he say, really, when the RAF won? A young signals officer asked him that afternoon. Gossip carried like contraband. Hecht considered. He could answer with the line about making the sky irrelevant. He could answer with the plans for submarines and rockets. He could answer with a refusal that had the shape of acceptance. He said, Hecht replied at last, that England had shown him a new kind of enemy. And he said we would answer with a new kind of weapon. It sounded like victory. It tasted like postponement. The signal's man nodded, not understanding and understanding perfectly. She had been a milliner's apprentice before the war, taught her a different kind of brim. Now, in a room under the Sussex chalk stuffed with cable and caffeine, Joan Dare sat at a cathode ray tube and watched the night grow pimples. Each bright pimple was a thing with men inside it. She had learned not to think that sentence too often. Track 3 Angels, bearing 085, speed 220, she called, and Daisy at the tote board copied numbers onto a strip that runners would hurry to the controller's table. Outside, the wind combed the hedgerows. In here, cigarette smoke combed throats. The system worked because it was boring. Joan understood that now. The drama happened elsewhere, in the sky, on roofs, inside anyone whose house was not where they had left it. But the victory lived here, in procedure. They called it chain home. To Joan, it was a sort of domestic magic. Tall radio masts tugged at the air confessed, and a woman with a pencil turned that confession into a vector for boys she had never met. She loved the moments when a plot faded because fighters had arrived in exactly the right place and the raiders had turned away. She also loved the moments when nothing happened at all. At 2 in the morning, the phone rang in that confidential way telephones adopt in war. The controller lifted the receiver, listened, and said, "Very good, sir." He put the handset down as if it contained eggs. "Berlin again," he said without sarcasm. "Our chaps went and knocked at the front door." Joan looked at her scope. "And they're sending the neighbors round the back," she murmured as new pimples blossomed. Somewhere across the channel, a man had decided London would not sleep. Somewhere in Kent, a pilot pulled on his boots and accepted that sleep was not a right but a ration. On a map in Germany, pins marched. On a street in Wapping, an ARP warden knocked on a door and shouted politely. Every act had its counteract, until the war looked less like a duel and more like a spreadsheet written in fire. 2. The message in the wolf's lair. Hecht's new desk in Berlin had sharper corners and duller windows. The telephone here had 2 extra buttons that did not appear on ordinary telephones. He learned to touch neither by accident. The Reichsmarshal continued to stage victories out of herbs. Factory chiefs were beaten with telegrams. Engineers were bribed with promises. Losses were called reallocations. Yet the day's arithmetic still came to him like a penitent who would not change. Then came a courier with a personal summons. To Rassenberg, the man said with the kind of cheer that was not a personality, but an order. The wolf's lair had grown since summer. More huts, more fences, more men who took their dinner standing up. The pines smelled of wet dogs. In the briefing hut, the map of England was still there, laminated with worry. New colors, new circles. Over the North Atlantic, neat arcs penciled with dates and shipping tonnage. The Kriegsmarine's romance of disappearance. Hitler entered unannounced, as always. His voice was gentle at the start, as always. "We have set the English a different problem," he said. "Let us see whether their system swims as well as it flies." Redder, permanently naval, tapped his pointer against the ocean. "Our U-boats have their teeth in the convoy lanes. Radar? They are inventing answers, but so are we. New frequencies, new sets. The English have more ships than we have submarines, but our mathematics is asymmetrical." Goring sniffed. "And London? We have been generous with their bedtime. They are learning to live underground," Hitler said. "It builds character." A small smile, private. "Besides, night teaches them the limits of their celebrated system. The chain that defended day is stretched at night. We will wear them out electrically." Hecht ventured. "My Führer, they do not tire as advertised. Their repair brigades function like veins. Each bomb starts a project." Hitler's eyes traveled to him with interest, as if Hecht were a bird that had landed on the wrong plate. "Then we shall start many projects," he said. "And while they build roofs, we will build rockets." He said the last word the way some men say a name they plan to marry. 3. Coventry, a furnace and a factory. The night the cathedral's ribs became stars, Heck stood with a small party on the edge of an airfield in France and watched a bomber stream form. Dark shapes climbing into the ink, lights blinked in coded winks, until discipline made even the blinking stop. Beside him, a navigator complained amiably about British flak and British weather and British insistence on manufacturing cities whose names were hard to pronounce. Coventry, Hecht repeated, working the syllables like a coin. Intelligence had taught the word to him. Machine tools, engines, the workhouse of the stubborn island. He wished, perversely, that he had never learned it. Hours later, the telegrams began. Good illumination. Main force on target. Fires visible to 100 kilometers. Hecht read them all and felt nothing he could name. By morning, the photographs arrived. Roofs opened like tins, streets chalked with hoses, the cathedral's nave a diagram of gravity. A victory, said the captions, and he nodded because that was the verb with which men were paid. 2 days later, a report crossed his desk that a factory in Coventry had relocated 3 machine tools to a dairy, 4 to a school, 6 to a church crypt. The workers arrived with lunch pails and prayed only that the power would stay. They are learning dispersion very quickly, Hecht wrote in a memo. We are teaching them the syllabus we will later have to pass. Goring, reading over his shoulder, scrawled, "Message, your melancholy is inefficient. For a new kind of weapon. At Peenemund, the Baltic bit the shore and engineers bit ideas." Hecht, sent as an observer because his superiors liked his caution around dreams, found himself in a community where dreams wore drawing numbers. The young Werner talked like a motorbike, fast, bright, oily with conviction. The older, sterner Dornberger kept the room attached to the ground. They showed Hecht a film of a rocket that left the frame before the applause could catch it. The pilot, Werner said, is mathematics. Hecht could not help himself. Mathematics can be shot down by weather. Then we will build weather that cannot be shot down. Werner answered, not as a joke. They described trajectories and inertial guidance, oxidizers and alcohol, pump speeds that, if mistaken, turned miracles into funerals. Hecht admired them in the way a man admires a bridge whose first span already leans toward gorge. He wrote a report that tried to be 2 things at once: encouraging without becoming a hymn, skeptical without becoming a heresy. Hitler read it and underlined only one sentence. The weapon promises to ignore the RAF's operating concept. Ignore the RAF. It was a seductive phrase. It suggested a shortcut through a forest that had defiantly regrown after every cutting. 5. The system swims. Out on the Atlantic, Captain Lieutenant Otto Brandt found his U-boat's winter rhythm. Submerge, listen, calculate, surface, run, submerge again. The ocean was a gray dog that sometimes tried to eat the boat and sometimes tried to nurse it. Convoys were shapes glimpsed in fog, a line of plodding cargo and a crown of escorts. When the night was soft, he could ride the surface and pretend to lounge. When the night had teeth, he lived by the headset, a stethoscope pressed to the water's chest. To Otto, the English system did indeed swim. Escort trader, escort carriers, appeared where mathematics insisted they could not. Antennas sprouted like suspicious weeds on destroyer masts. Aircraft that should have been asleep stood watch, their pilots learning to love the altitudes where breath is an account you keep on paper. He sank 2 ships in March and believed again in destiny. In May, a Liberator with a ridiculous belly and a very serious radar found him in weather that ought to have been camouflage. Depth charges translated loudly. The boat survived, buckled, and appalled. Otto wrote in his journal, "We are clever hunters, and they are clever farmers. Farmers get up every morning." 6. In London, the night teaches. The Blitz tried to be a single noun, but was, in practice, a verb conjugated nightly. Londoners conjugated back. I shelter, you shovel. He repairs, we boil tea. You curse, they claim we are inspired. Joan's boyfriend, Harry, flew a night fighter whose greatest weapon was patience. The enemy lit cities. Harry sat in darkness and waited for a ground controller to make geometry out of radio. When the controller was very, very good and the sky very, very cooperative, Harry found a bomber's tail and turned the dull night bright for 2 seconds. Then he flew home and was given bacon. One night, Joan left the bunker to find the street varnished with hose water and the moon complaining faintly behind smoke. On a corner, a hand-painted sign hung from a lamppost. Open, tea, 2 pence. There were still prices because there was still rhythm. She went in and discovered that grief tastes better with milk. A man at the next table told her, not to be gallant, but because information wanted company, that German radios had begun to say England would soon be punished in a way she had never imagined. New weapons, he said. Whatever that means. We already had new weapons. They were called bombs. Joan nodded. If they've invented a new night, she said, I would like a different job. 7. The sentence Hitler saved for himself. In the wolf's lair, summer came as a rumor of warmth that dared not become air. The map of England was moved to a sidewall. The map of Russia took pride of place, an expanse where commanders pushed divisions as if calories were infinite. Yet England remained a problem in his mind, a variable that refused to resolve. Reports of RAF intrusions into German airspace, Hamburg, the Ruhr, accumulated like flies. Area bombing. The German press called it, with a rage that equaled honesty. Hitler reacted in layers, public thunder, private ice. He directed Göring to promise retaliation so magnificent the word itself would blush. He ordered resources to Piemont with a priority that made generals jealous. To Keitel he said, the English are a clock. We must become the hammer that strikes without caring what time it is. To himself, walking alone in the birchwood where guards pretended not to see him, he said a different sentence. We must find a way to erase their system, not merely elude it. The difference between elude and erase occupied him the way certain melodies occupy lesser men. 8. Firestorm. Hamburg burned as if an irresponsible god had tried to light all the candles at once. Hecht read reports that belonged to a planet without weather, temperatures at which lead became sympathy, winds that did not blow so much as devour. The RAF had learned a choreography, high explosive to break roofs, incendiaries to feed roofs to chemistry, and the Americans had brought daylight arithmetic to night's philosophy. Göring raged. Goebbels wrote phrases whose adjectival clause were longer than their nouns. Hitler watched film of the ruins and said very little. He asked, with genuine interest, for data about British aircraft production during the same period, as if hoping for a graph that dipped at the same time the city did. It did not. The graph wrinkled and resumed climbing. Their system is becoming amphibious, Hecht told a colleague. It swims, it flies, it builds underwater. The colleague shrugged and lit another cigarette. Men have only so much room for metaphors. 9. First buzz. The first time London heard the V1, it misunderstood. The engine's stutter sounded like an old motorcycle applauding itself. Then the motor cut and the applause stopped, and the city discovered that silence is an altitude. The explosion that followed had a personality, lower than high explosive, less sharp than a big bomb, more like the thump of a giant slow hand. Hitler, informed, allowed himself a rare, satisfied exhalation. See, he said to no one in particular, we have created a weapon that ignores their pilots, their radar, their chivalry. Hecht read the first operational analyses with a mathematician's melancholy. Accuracy was adequate for a city. The weapons were cheap enough to be many. Countermeasures appeared at once. Fighters the speed of tidings, guns moved in belts, barrage balloons with steel nerves. The English gave the weapon a nickname, Doodlebug, Contempt's pet name for fear, and then went about writing it into their system. They calculated average flight times, predicted cutoff points, organized anti-diver patrols. The city learned to read the sky's grammar, buzz, pause, fall. Children learned a new tense for hope. Hecht stood at a window in Berlin and listened to distant guns, not defense, but practice for a different front. He closed his eyes and tried to imagine a machine that could be as accurate as a sentence. When he opened them, the window showed him only smoke that did not know what it meant. 10. You will not turn this into poetry. Göring staged a conference for confidence. Commanders arrived with faces that had learned new verbs: displace, disperse, ration. Engineers came with slides. The room was too warm. Anxiety warmed it more. A young officer, Hecht did not catch his name, presented a study of RAF night fighter interceptions. Correlation with radar picket ships in the channel suggests coordination at a level that treats our flights as entries in a ledger. When we vary altitudes randomly, interception declines by. Göring slapped the table. "You will not turn this into poetry," he said. "I do not want odes to their system. I want ruptures in it." Hecht spoke anyway. "Ruptures require knowledge of the tissue," he said. "Odes are merely diagrams read aloud." There was laughter, then quiet. Göring looked at him with an expression that could have been admiration in another decade. "Very well, diagrammer," he said. "Where would you cut?" Hecht pointed, not at a city, not at a runway, but at the factories that made spares. "They have built a world where anything broken is briefly ill, not dead. We must increase the time between illness and recovery." Göring made a note. It was not acted on. Nothing in Germany, now, moved fast unless it was falling. 11. The U-boat's last mathematics. By 1943, Otto Brandt was a veteran in a world that no longer believed veterans were a resource. The Bay of Biscay became a bombing range with bad manners. The snorkel solved one problem and invented three. The new radar could see things that had once been shy. Otto's crew performed well, which meant they performed ritual inside a metal tube. He began to think of the Allies not as enemies, but as a climate. Climate is not courageous. Climate is not cowardly. Climate simply is. You do not defeat weather. You survive it or you move. The last convoy he attacked ended with his boat damaged and his confidence appropriately modern. He wrote home, "Tell Hans to be an engineer. Heroes are men the system has not learned to use properly." He put the letter in a pouch that probably went down with a transport 12 days later. 12. The rocket with no face. The V, too impressed because it refused to argue. It arrived supersonic and left summaries. There was very nearly no warning. Londoners heard only the end of their sentences. Even the RAF, with all its cunning, could not intercept a stoop from the stratosphere. Hitler loved the weapon for that. "At last," he said, "an instrument that treats the English as the prey they are." He toured models, touched skins that would soon be scorched, asked questions that made engineers feel simultaneously blessed and endangered. Hecht stood at Piemont again and watched one climb. The contrail wrote something autobiographical across the sky. He would have admired it longer, but a senior engineer mentioned how many trains it took to bring the fuel, and how many slaves it took to mine the ore, and how many quiet deaths it took to keep the line on the graph pointing up. Hecht walked to the shore and let the Baltic tell him the truth without adjectives. The weapon came late. The weapon came dear. The weapon did not decide. It would never break the RAF because the RAF was not a thing that broke. It was a way of repairing. He wrote that in a notebook he would never submit. 13. What Hitler said then. The final winter coiled around Germany like a road you could not step off. Reports turned into obituaries. Maps shrank like clothes that had met the wrong water. Hitler, increasingly subterranean, received a summary of V-weapon effectiveness that did not coddle. It noted tonnage, disruptions, panic. It noted, with the decency of numbers, that the English had adapted and continued to fight a larger war with undiminished rhythm. He read in silence. "Men waited for Turnde." Instead, he said, "They are ants. Keitel cautious. My Führer." "They are ants who have taught themselves to work as if a god were watching," Hitler said. "We needed more gods. We built more altars. They built more ants." He pushed the paper away as if it had a temperature. "Very well," he said. "We will become myth where we cannot be arithmetic." He meant propaganda, proclamations, last stands that would look tidy in legends. Men who preferred sums to sagas shivered. What he did not say, at least not for men, was the sentence Hecht had heard once in the woods. "We must erase their system." He had tried. The era refused. 14. The last briefing Hecht attended. It was April, and Berlin sounded like a foundry that had learned to speak Russian. The briefing room was a tunnel of voices and maps that no longer pretended to be about England at all. Yet a file lay on the table with a blue stripe, Air Defense of the Reich status. Hecht leafed it with a tenderness he did not expect to feel. Tiny arrows still demonstrated intent. Squadrons still existed on paper with vigor denied to their engines. The RAF appeared in the margins now as a nightly inevitability, not an adversary that required plans. Someone asked for a summary of the English question. No one laughed. Hecht, because he had once been the man who could speak sentences around maps, stood. The English question, he said, was answered in 1940. We asked whether courage could defeat systems. We discovered that systems metabolize courage. They ate their fear and our bravery and turned both into procedure. Goring, monstrous and diminished, waved a hand. History, he said with a fatigue that sounded like a confession, was not supposed to be a factory. No, Hecht agreed, but it is. He sat down. The map did not look at him. 15, the girl at the scope, again. On a morning when the Thames looked like beaten tin, Joan Dare came off the night shift and climbed the stairs from the bunker into a daylight that had learned to be cautious about itself. The war was not yet over, but it had started wanting to be. A WAF friend pressed a newspaper into her hands. There was a photograph. Pilots grinning around a wing like boys who had been allowed to keep their toys, factories with banners, a crowd in Trafalgar Square rehearsing for something they pretended not to rehearse. The headline was assertive in that British way that whispered while it shouted. Joan bought a roll from a stall and ate it walking. She passed a church whose roof had been mended in a way that still allowed the eye to remember where the sky had once got in. She liked that. Memory and repair can share building. A doodlebug's cough sounded in the distance, one of the last, and cut. Somewhere else, men took cover. Somewhere else, a street forgot and remembered an address. Somewhere else, a system politely wrote down the time and the bearing and called a fighter whose pilot would spend the afternoon telling a mechanic that the trim felt funny. Joan smiled at nothing. She had stayed awake so that others could sleep. She had watched the pimples and given them names. She had learned to love boredom because boredom meant survival arranged on purpose. When anyone asked her in later years what Hitler had said when the RAF won, she would not quote speeches. She would say, "He started looking for a way around us." She would not add, because it would sound unkind, and he never found one that worked. 16. Epilogue. The sentence history remembers. In courtrooms and classrooms after the war, men argued about genius and will, about totalitarian energy and democratic stubbornness. They quoted speeches because speeches are easy to print. They printed photographs because photographs are easy to admire. The RAF pilots kept their laconic mouths. The radar girls married and never entirely told their husbands what the night had sounded like. The U-boat men went home if home still had rooms, and sometimes they stood at the edge of winter lakes and tried to like the sound of silence. The engineers took their mathematics to other continents, other projects that promised to be pure and rarely were. As for Hitler, biographers found 100 ways to say that he never admitted defeat in the Battle of Britain. It is true enough. He did something less theatrical and more common. He reframed the question until he could call the answer a plan. What he said, finally, was a sentence composed of many smaller sentences spoken in many rooms. If the sky will not break, make it irrelevant. If the pilots will not yield, ignore them. If the island will not fall, starve it. If hunger fails, find a weapon that does not care about courage. And what history answered, slowly, was its own sentence. Courage inside a system is not ignorable. The English had invented a way to turn fear and brass and coffee and electricity into a web that caught bombs, or at least caught the consequences. It was not romantic. It was not even particularly fair. But it was enough. Hecht, who survived long enough to be denazified and then forgotten, kept one photograph from the war, a line of hurricanes muddy as dogs and a dog watching men. On the back he wrote, late, with a clarity that tasted like defeat and health at once. They won because they could be replaced without being erased. He folded the picture into a book and lived on, which is the longest victory available to anyone who has been near maps. And if you strain your ear, even now, you can still hear the RAF's real reply to Hitler. Clocks, pencils, rakes on felt, engine checks, voices saying, Angels 20 without drama. All the mundane thunder of a system that refused to be made irrelevant.